Okay, so the idea of today's studio is to add some forms to our HTML pages that will allow us to simulate or allow us to create a very small search application that uses existing search engines. Right. We're going to do this by sending those websites requests, and then they'll pop us back some information. Specifically, what's supposed to happen is when we type in a search and then select one of the engines, it will actually take us to their web page and not keep us bound to our index.html. And then we'll search for our query. So there's some information that they give us here. This is pretty important. Search engines have a single text input and they submit their data using a GET request. We're going to need to remember this for later once we start typing out our code. And then they also tell us that most search engines, most of the popular ones, use the same name for their search parameter, which is just the letter Q, Q standing for query. And you could test it, right? We could go to google.com, not OCOM. We go to google.com and I just do a search for Google 405 error. If I go to my web address up here, notice how after the protocol and domain name, we go into the search director or we go to the search page and then we start a query string. That question mark that tells us query. And then there's a key value pair. Q equals Google 405 error. We don't really care about what happens after that. That doesn't concern us. But what matters is that there's a query string right here and it represents the search we put in. And if I do an inspect on the network and I search for this again, among many, many other things, I should have a GET request for this search, which was search query, blah, 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 blah. A request method that sends as a GET request and gets us, as long as it loads, a 200 request or a 200 web code. Okay, now let's get started. First things first, go to the repo, fork it. I've already forked it. Okay. My repositories. Okay, so I've already forked it to my page, to my GitHub. After that, I press the green clone button, I copy the link, and then I open VS Code. Did they make you do this? Yeah, we're doing this in VS Code. Here in VS Code, I'm going to navigate to my LC, my launch code folder. I really have to change that. And I'll do a git clone of the link. And then I will do a code HTTP Inform Studio, and that'll open a new window for VS Code. This repo only contains one page, index.html. They chose to put the script tags inside the HTML body. This is good. You could also start a scripts.js page and link that to the index.html, however you want to do it. So first things first, we need to create some form inputs. Now remember, inputs are areas where we can either select options, input text to be submitted. There are various types of ways to pick things for user input. In this case, they're asking us to start with creating a text input within the form and set its name attribute to the value Q. So here in my body, I have a set of form tags that they gave us an ID for. I wonder if we'll be using that later. Let's make our text input. How do I start this? What's the tag I use to create an input field? Label's close, but not quite. Starts with input. Thank you. Input. And it's a self-closing tag, so It doesn't have a closing end pair. Now inside the input, we have to add an attribute. What is that attribute that we're adding to this input tag or input element? Type and name, good. Type denotes what kind of input we're using, and name is its associated name. So what type of input this is this? We called it a what input?
Text.
Text, good. Text inputs are those single line bars that we write stuff in. And what was the name they wanted us to give it? It was Q. Okay, well, let's see the form. So I'm going to do start index.html. And I can see here that I've got a submit box, or I've got an input box. And when I inspect it, there it is, input type text, name Q. Cool, so we're that far. That's all it asks. Now it's saying to create a radio group with one radio button for each search engine. Recall that radio buttons with the same name are groups, so use the same value for the attribute, this attribute, and then engine on each radio button. Okay, syntax. How do I start a radio button set? Label. What does the label tag do, Colin?
Just put text to the left of the button.
Left or right. Yep. Because you could put the input first, then type the text after it. So a label will allow us to add some visual text to our input, which, speaking of input, should the input go outside the label tag or inside of it?
Inside of it.
Inside.
Good. Who wants to take a crack at why it has to go inside?
Otherwise, it wouldn't be associated with that particular input.
Good, good, good. This input needs to be, basically, the label needs to correspond to this input, therefore the input has to go inside. All right, so the type of this input is a radio. So type radio, and then whoo. That's a lot of stuff. Wind rating. This looks like it might be from exercises. All right, what was the name they told us that this radio button has to be? Engine, right? And they said each radio button has to have the same name. So let's do that. This will be Google. And now I'm just going to copy and paste these for the other 4 search forms. This one is DuckDuckGo, not Go, Go. This one is Bing. And this one is Ask. When I go and refresh the page, I now see that I have label, radio button, label, radio button, label, radio button, label, radio button. They're on the same line. So if I want to break this up, I can use a line break tag. And now these labels, these radio labels, will appear below my search bar. If you want to customize that further, that is your choice. Okay, finally add a submit button to the form and set its value to go. So this one's pretty simple, right? It's just a button. Okay. And then set it to go, not Game of Thrones, go. You know what? I'm actually going to put it here. When I refresh the page, there it is. There's my go button. So let's search for banana. Banana, are you able to change the position? Yeah, you can. So the order that items are put inside the label will determine where the radio button will appear. So if I put ask all the way over here on the right-hand side, take a look at what happens. The radio button moved to the left. Okay, refresh. So I'm going to search for banana on Google's engine. And nothing happened. Why? I set my inputs up. I looked for something. Why am I not getting anything?
Need the links.
Okay, where do I need the links? So what's going on? When I click this button, nothing's really happening, right? Good. That's what I was looking for, Adam. It's because there's no action. In the form, we need to have some kind of action occur in order for a request to be actually sent out. So an action, something. We don't know what it is yet. We're going to figure it out. And that was a hint, like, we have a form with inputs now, but now we have to send it data somewhere. So the action attribute determines where a form submits data, but we can't set the action attribute on the form in our HTML. Our form needs to submit data to a different site based on the selected search engine. So this is saying that based on what radio button I click, that should determine which search engine I use. So if I click Google, it should be the same as going to google.com and putting my search item in this bar. Same with Bing. If I put my search item in this bar and I select the Bing option, when I hit enter or when I click go, then it should simulate a search, or it should execute a search from this web engine, search engine. So first we have to add an action. And what else? Is there anything else we need to do? Yeah, we have to make the handler first, but let's make sure that the action works. So I'm going to grab one of the URLs here, this search URL. So https://www.google.com/search. I'm going to set that as my action. So no matter what I pick, it's going to go through Google. And so I'm going to search for banana. When I hit go, notice how I was taken to google.com/search and then a query string for banana. Okay, so we know our inputs work, our radio buttons work. Now we just have to set it up. That's why I didn't delete earlier. Okay, I can track myself. Okay, that might be a lie. So now we got to go and start adding the JavaScript. So what's first? Create and register the handler. Within the script element near the top of the file, create a function named setSearchEngine. Okay. So this is going outside of the add event listener that they gave us. So function setSearchEngine, and it didn't tell me to add any parameters, so I'm not going to. And then in here, we'll just do a console log statement to make sure it works. Now in here, what I'm going to do is on window load, I'm going to call setSearchEngine. So what should happen is every time the window loads, I should see on my console, I should see on my console my name, which I do. Console outputs Gerard. So that function's good. And the function call in this add event listener is good. All right. Now we can start coding the actual function. You first need to get the form element using one of the DOM's methods. Okay. So how do we grab the form? How do we grab this? Because this is the form we have. This is our only set of form tags. How can we use one of our selectors in order to grab it? Tell me how it works, or show me some syntax, or both if you're feeling spicy. Okay, I know. Okay, the ID, the form has an ID called search form. That's good to notice. How can we use that? How can we use that to find the form, to have JavaScript find the HTML and turn it into JavaScript friendly code? form.add event. Well, I can't do that because I don't have JavaScript attached to the form yet. So you're one step too far ahead. Darren said get element by ID. That's pretty good. Janice adds some syntax. Very good. So remember this document, we're grabbing from the document is what they told us. There's this method to the document class called get element by ID. And what it does is it searches the HTML for a particular ID, and then it grabs the entire element associated with it. And the ID in our case is search form. And now I just need to store this into a variable. So let form equal document.getElementById by ID search form. And now I've taken all of lines 22 through 30 and I've stuffed them into my form variable. Now I can do things with them. So what did they say? Set search engine as a handler to the form submit event. So when we talk about these handlers, we're talking about event.add event, or not event, but add event handler. It's something.add event handler. It could be a window handler, it could be a document handler, it could be a single element handler. What they want from us is to create a handler for the form. So form.add event listener. I keep saying add event handler, but it's add event listener. And we need to listen for a particular event. Remember, a listener is waiting for a particular web event to happen, whether it's the page loads, or I click something with my mouse, or I hit the tilde key. Could be that specific. In this case, it is, I am working right now as a handler to the form submit event. So the event we put in here is submit. And then afterwards, we add a call to the set search engine function method. So that's this part. This is saying that anytime I click the go button or I hit enter when I'm in my text box, I want to run the set search engine method. And we'll test this. Oh, well, sort of test it. Because this is still set to an action, it's actually performing the action. So I kind of want to stop the code first. So I'll do what's called event.prevent default. Who remembers what event.prevent default does?
Stops the event from happening.
Good. Which it didn't this time, but that's just because I wrote the event.prevent default in the wrong place. There we go. So now I see the console log. So set search engine is correctly linked to this event of submit. It only happens when I press go or hit enter. Good. So we'll take these out, or maybe we'll take this out. Okay, what's next? Next, I have to set the action. So our event handler now runs when the form is submitted, but it doesn't do anything. We have to set the action on the form based on the user's choice of search engine. Then it tells you add code to set search engine to get the selected radio button element using document.querySelector. So they tell you what to use this time. So it says grab the selected radio element. So let selected radio, and we're going to set that equal to a document.querySelector. Who remembers what document.querySelector does?
It's like get element or get ID element.
Okay, but what is it choosing rather than ID? Because they're similar, right?
The index, or no, that's the same thing as ID. I'm not sure.
That's okay. You got it partway there, so that's good.
Okay.
So a query selector differs from get element by ID in that get element ID is always looking for an ID, whereas query selector can look for basically any HTML element or even sub attribute. In this case, we need to get an input element. But the reason why input is not going to work every time is because query selector only returns the very first instance of this element occurring. So the input element occurs here on line 29, but if I selected anything from lines 30 through 32, query selector with just input wouldn't work. So we have to go a little more specific. By using square brackets, we're allowed to grab sub attributes of an element by the name of the sub element of sub attribute and then the value of the sub attribute. In this case, we want to get the first query or the first element that has element input and attribute name equals engine. Well, that doesn't get us very much further because name engine is the same for all of these 4 inputs. So finally, if there are any other associated sub attributes, we use colon and then the name of the attribute, which is checked. Checked on a radio box, on a radio input or a checkbox input means that the option has been selected. So this input with name of engine being checked means I need to look for an input element with a name attribute equaling engine, and it has to be checked. Let's test this to make sure it works. Derek was asking, how was I possibly supposed to figure this out? You weren't, and that's why the book gave it to us and gave us that explanation below it. So let's test it. So I run the code. I go and I'm going to select the ask option. When I hit go, I should get a console log of the entire input associated with ask, which this wouldn't really tell us anything, but the line over here, index.html, line 9. Not here. Line 9 is telling us where that's sourced from, but if I set like if I set a value attribute to each of these, like Google DuckDuckGo, Bing, and ask. Now, if I set these values and I refresh and I choose Bing, now in the console, it should show me, oh, it should show me Bing. So we know our selector is working correctly. Okay. So once we get the proper radio button, we need to get its value using .value. This value tells us which search engine the user has chosen. So remember that everything we grab with a query selector or get element by ID is an instance of a certain class, whether it's an instance of a document class, instance of an element class. Therefore, they are all objects. And because they're all objects, we're allowed to access their methods and properties. So let chosen engine equal selected radio dot value. And we'll console log chosen engine now. We'll add B there. So now I'll refresh the page, select Google or DuckDuckGo, and it prints out DuckDuckGo, that value attribute that I just set earlier. Okay, what's next? They tell us at this stage we could use a large if/else if, right? if the engine equals Google, turn the action into Google. If it's Bing, make it Bing. They're telling us this is ugly and inefficient. Well, it works. I don't need you berating me, Mr. Launch Code Book. But let's play it their way. They suggest that we create an object called actions. And with it, we should set key value pairs. I'm going to take this one as a sample. It's a little incomplete. So the key here is Google, and the value here is the search engine, google.com/search. So the keys here should represent the values here in our inputs. So Google will be a key, DuckDuckGo will be a key, Bing will be a key, and Ask will be a key. And they should all have associated values with them, which are these search URLs. So duckduckgo.com. Here's Bing. Then I grab bing.com/search. And finally, Ask. I can't believe this site is still up after like 20 something years. Ask.com/web. So now I've got an object that's full of my 4 search engines and associated with, or they have keys associating to them. Now we can write some logic, right? So this action here starts blank, and we need to fill it in with one of these URLs. At the moment, we have a chosen engine variable, which represents one of these 4 words. How can I then get one of these 4 actions using object syntax? So let chosen action equal. How can I get to this google.com/search if I have Google? What can I use to access it in the object? Could be actions.google, but actions.google hard codes it so that it's always Google, right? What do I want to get actions, but my selected, the chosen one? Darren said bracket notation. Bracket notation is good. I'd say dot notation also works, but I'm going to prefer bracket notation. So how am I using bracket notation to access one of these from inside this? Show me some syntax. Not quite, Adam. With an object, how do we access an object's property given its key? Okay, Darren is very close. So if we type actions bracket Google, and this was the same as Janice's answer with actions.google, we are accessing the actions object at the key of Google. So that will give us google.com/search. But I can't hard code Google in here. I have to put a variable that represents one of these. That could be any one of these at any given time based on maybe what a user selects. Joe's about as close as we can get right now. Should be, remember this chosen engine? This chosen engine variable takes my selected radio, which is this document query selector, and it grabs the value of that. Remember that selected radio grabs one of these 4 input lines. It either grabs Google, DuckDuckGo, Bing, or Ask. And once it has that whole element tag, it's allowed to access the attributes of that element using dot notation. So here on line 16, chosen engine was selected radio dot value. Selected radio was any one of these 4 inputs, and dot value was associated with the name over here. Right? That's how we get the dot value. So when creating chosen action, we should access actions at the key, which is one of these. And guess what? These words are exactly the same as the words of these values. And so you should grab chosen engine as the name of our key. Console log to show that. So let's refresh the page. I want to choose DuckDuckGo. That's my chosen engine. When I hit go, my console spits out https duckduckgo.com, which is the value associated with the key DuckDuckGo. This is like using object notation. We're eventually going to grab the whole object and grab the key value property of the object and grab the property based off of the key of the object. So now we've created variables to select all the way down to our search action. All that's left is to set this, whatever this URL is, which is chosen action, to my action right here. So what HTML element, what element am I affecting if I need to edit this action? Which element or which tag? Scott said form. Does anyone agree with Scott? It's not a huge vote of confidence. I agree with Scott. Form is the element, the tag that we are trying to affect because it contains the action attribute. Luckily for us, we've already set a variable for form here in add event listener, but it doesn't exist in set search engine because of scope. So all we have to do is copy line 24 and add it to our list of variables. Now my set search engine method function has access to the form. Okay. Now that we have access to the form, there's a method that allows us to change its attributes. We mentioned this in passing in the DOM chapter. Does anyone remember? Did the book just give it to you? No. No, they didn't. Oh, they did. The book gave it to you right before the bonus missions. Now you can get the action URL using action bracket notation and the name, the value of the selected radio button. Once you have the action URL, find the form element and set its action using set attribute. There's the method set attribute. So form.set attribute takes in 2 arguments. First, the attribute that you want to edit or set, and second, the value of that attribute. So in this case, we're editing the action attribute, right? Action over here. And we're setting it to our chosen action. Remember, this is chosen action is the URL that we pick from the object. Let's test it. I'm going to take off the event.prevent default now. And if all goes well, when I search for banana in DuckDuckGo, my JavaScript will fill in duckduckgo.com into the form action, and then it will take me to DuckDuckGo's search website. So let's hit go. You see a bunch of post errors here. A lot of this is my pop-up blockers. But notice that we got taken to DuckDuckGo's search engine. We're out of my index.html page, right? We're now on a web page. We made a request to the DuckDuckGo servers with a query of Banania, and it has responded with these search results. Let's test it again for Bing. On Bing, let's look up launch code. Hit enter. I'm taken to the Bing search results for launch code. Look, the first result is the website. That's it. That's Studio. Is it still showing Google no matter what you pick? Did you make sure that you removed the text from the action field, from the action attribute here? There could be a number of reasons why it's just showing Google, but that's my first guess. Actually, you know what? We can troubleshoot this after. I want Clark to be able to make some announcements before I let everyone go. So we'll stop the recording.